and welcome back to another episode of Tim Two Wheels. So in the garage today, I have a project bike that belongs to a friend of my son's. It is a 1979 Honda CB750K. Those are very popular bikes to be turned into cafe racers, and that's exactly what was done to this bike. I'm not real clear on the history of this bike. He bought it used, and it was already kind of stripped down and converted into a cafe racer, but the bike had some issues. The head had been removed from the engine, and in the process there had been several broken bolts in the head. And so the project today is going to be essentially going in, removing a lot of these broken bolts, getting the head back in good condition, cleaning it up, and getting the head reassembled. Right now it is literally a basket case. The head is in several buckets, and you'll see that later on. So for today's project, we're going to be reassembling, correcting those issues and reassembling the head on a 1979 Honda CB750K. Now the 79 was the first year that Honda transitioned over from the single overhead cam to a dual overhead cam. There's quite a few videos out there on the single overhead cam, the older engines. There's not that many on the dual overhead cam, which is one of the reasons I wanted to make this video. So for anybody who's looking to reassemble a head, hopefully this will be helpful to you. All right, so let's go ahead and get started on this project. Okay, so this is the original CB750 engine that came out of the bike. It's got a good bottom end. The problem was there was some damage to the heads on the top end, some strip bolts, some broken bolts, and things of that nature, which can be repaired, and we may do that later. But the owner of this bike has a donor engine that they want to swap out just the top half and put it on this bike and see if we can get it running as cheaply and as easily as possible. So that's the project. So on this bench, this is our donor motor, which you can tell because it's all black. But this engine that the owner of the bike had managed to get to use has some issues in the bottom end, the bottom half, but has a good top half or top end. So that's why we're going to basically just swap the top end off of this motor, put it on the original motor, which has a good bottom end, and see if we can get this thing up and running. All right, so I'm going to stop right here and say that the original plan was to remove the head complete off of the donor motor and put over onto the original motor. That's what the owner wanted to do. That was his plan. After getting in there, I was able to remove the broken studs that were on the original head, get it cleaned up. So I advised him that if it was my bike, I would just reassemble the original head, and that way you're keeping the original motor all original. Now the plan has changed from swapping the head to just reassembling the original head and using any parts that were needed that had been broken off of the original motor, take those from the donor and put onto the original. So that's what we're going to do. So in addition to the two donor engines, or I'm sorry, the original engine and the donor engine, he does have all the parts that came off of the original engine. So we have literally a basket case here. We've got the parts, the two cams, timing chain, those parts here. We got some covers and bolts and breather tubes or filters for the carbs. Down below, I have a bucket. And down below here, I have a bucket with the carb bank in here and a lot of the other miscellaneous parts, the coils, all the other parts that we need to get this guy back up and running. So this is the head off of the original bike. Of course, there's a cotter key here, but this is the original valve cover. And since this is a 79 model year, it is a dual overhead cam. Again, everything is in good shape here. There were a couple of bolts apparently broken off or stripped. Okay, so here on the cylinders, as you can see now, I've got all the pistons cleaned up, a lot of the carbon off of those. I've got the surface cleaned up nice and smooth. Everything is good and clean. We now have a new head gasket that I can apply to this, and we can go ahead and begin assembly. Okay, so one trick on the reassembly, you want to get your chain tensioner, your cam chain tensioners retracted, if you will. So there's really two that you have to worry about. One is this one here in the rear that is more of a vertical. And what you need to do is loosen around back. You know, so there's two nuts. Cap nuts back here. Let me spin around just a little bit more so you can get a view of that. But there's these two cap nuts, one here and one here, which is in between the intakes. So you want to loosen those and then press in on that bow that's on the cam tensioner and then tighten these back up. And that'll hold it in and retract it. Okay, so, and the other one is this one that runs horizontally here. And this is for the chain that runs between the two camshafts that times them. So there in the front of the head, there is a bolt here. Now on this bolt, you want to be careful. You want to loosen this nut here first. That is your lock nut. What had happened with the previous owner is try to take this out without loosening that lock nut, and just by removing the bolt head, you will twist this off, and that's exactly what happened to the old one. And here you can see this is what was broken off inside, and I had to drill that out and use an easy out type of bolt extractor to get that out of there. And it was a bit of a pain, but we finally got it. So when you loosen this, which I already have it, you'll see how that springs up here. There's a piston or a pin that goes in, slides, and this bolt tightens against that. So what you want to do to put the chains back on is to get in here and press down. You can use your finger or use something. I've got like a small hammer handle here that I can use to get a little better leverage. And see, I'm pushing it down to where that piston slides all the way forward. And then I'm going to go ahead and tighten that nut to where it will keep it retracted like that. Now I'm not tightening the lock nut at this point. I'm leaving that backed off because what I'm going to do is once I get the cam chains in there, we'll be backing that off and then locking that in place. Okay, so now that the head is sitting back on, the next step is going to be to tighten down the actual head bolts. So I'm getting the washers in place. Make sure everything's cleaned up and on here. And then we'll go through and tighten them in a specific sequence. Snug them down, then we'll torque them to spec. So there is the washer that goes on, and then the cap head nut. I'm just getting each one started by hand right now. And then I'll go through, snug them up with a wrench, just snug, and then come back and actually start to torque in the right sequence in a crisscross pattern. And I'll show you that detail here in just a moment. The specifications say to torque this to between 26 and 29 foot-pounds. So what I've done, and there is a specific order that you should go through, as with any torquing of anything you want to go through in a crisscross pattern. And I've gone through, and I originally have my torque wrench set to roughly 16 foot-pounds, and I've gone through and torqued them all to 16 foot-pounds in the proper sequence. And so now what I'm going to do is go back to the final torque specs, set that, and I'll go back and retorque them. I don't like to go, and this is debatable, I guess, amongst mechanics can probably chime in here and tell me whether there's anything to this or not. But I like to go through and basically torque at half value, or somewhere around half value, maybe a little more initially, especially when you're doing something as big as a head this size on a bike or on any engine. Then I go back and instead of torquing from 0 all the way up to max torque, each one I like to torque them all down kind of half torque, then go back and torque to my final torque specs. So for this, I'm using a Tecton 24335 torque wrench, which is available through toolvector.com. I'll put a link below for you. So I'm going to go ahead now and back this nut off and go ahead and bring it on up to my final torque spec. So there's 20 foot-pounds there. And it says 26 to 29. So what I'm going to do is come on up to 28. It's not quite to the max, but it's going to be very close. And then I tighten down my lock nut here. And these are 14 millimeter nuts that are on here, by the way. It's funny, the actual Honda service manual says that it's a 10 millimeter cap nut, which is not right. Perhaps the bolt size itself is 10 millimeter. That makes sense. But I just wanted to point out that it is a 14 millimeter socket to fit this. Also in this diagram, which is really hard to see, but essentially according to this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you come out here to 5, 6, and then we'll go 7, 8, and then jump back over here to go 9, 10, 11, 12. So that's the sequence in which we're going to be tightening these. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Here we're going to go number 1 up here, which is actually the H capstan. And this is the front of the motor, the exhaust side. This is the intake side, just for reference in case you want some orientation there. So again, I'm just going to come in here and gently apply pressure until I get my torque right there. Broke. So then we come over here and do number 2. There. And I'm just holding the engine to keep it from sliding around here. And then this was number 3 back here. Then we come over here for number 4. In that crisscross pattern. So then we go over here for number 5. And then we're going to come over here for number 6. And then 7 was back up here. There we go. 8 is going to be over here. And then lastly we have 9, 10, then 11 and 12. All right, So that's all of the head bolts. Head cap bolts are torqued down to spec. All right, so next we can reattach the bolts here in the front that go up under here, and then we'll begin reattaching the oil line in the back and step through the rest of the reassembly sequence as specified in the service manual. Okay, one of the things I want to show you here, whether you can see down in here or not, but the timing chain I have laying down in there gently so that I can retrieve it. And what I've made is just this little piece of wire, just made a slight hook. And what this wire is for is just so that I can reach down in here and grab that timing chain and pull it up out here where it's supposed to be. Then I've got this wooden dowel that I just lay in between there, and that's going to hold the chain up as I work with it. This is the exhaust camshaft sprocket. And this is a dual cog because the larger gear is driven by the cam chain, which is around my thumb, that goes down to the actual crankshaft, and then the smaller sprocket drives the chain that goes over to the back to the intake cam. So on this side of it with the larger sprocket, you'll notice these four flat areas, and two of them have marks on it, the here and here, those two dots. So those are alignment marks that you want to get basically parallel with the top of the case, at the top of the head as you put this on. So just keep that in mind. Now initially you can't put the cam chain or the crankshaft timing chain right on the larger gear. It won't give you enough room to work it. So I usually just drop it down in between or put it on this smaller gear. So let's go ahead and get this in here and get it aligned. You can see I'm keeping the dots aligned in this manner, basically parallel with the top surface of the head. Now also, as I showed you earlier, we've got the tensioners backed all the way out to give us as much slack as we possibly can. So I'm going to slip this gear just a little bit to try to keep these parallel to the top like that. It doesn't have to be exact, but you do want it to get as close as you can. Alright, so now we have the exhaust cam. I'm going to begin working in from this side through gear, and you just have to twist so that the lobes fit through the actual through the cam to the gear. And then finally we get over here, and then before that's done, I'm going to take the other timing chain and work it to get it in place. And I'm just going to lay that over here, give us some slack. Now the lobes here, they're pointing up right now, we want those to angle in toward the spark plug for cylinder 1. We'll turn this, there's also these alignment marks here on the end. And then we'll work to align the bolts back here. Trying to keep this other timing chain. I'm going to go ahead and bring that chain up. Okay, so I've got the chain on the larger sprocket with the alignment where I think it needs to be. Now the chain is on the smaller sprocket. Get it up onto the gear where the holes are aligned with the camshaft. Alright, so now we have these two the two bolts that go in there, and the specs do call for putting some thread locking material. I was struggling with getting the cap off of my blue thread locker. So I'm going to put that on here. In doing some of this work, my camera quit recording and I didn't realize that the battery had died in it. I was just working away, but basically I've got both camshafts in, the timing chain's connected, got the oil crossover tube installed. You see it dripping a little oil here because I have all the covers on, and the oil pockets are filled now with clean motor oil. The oil pockets being these sections here where the valves are. You want those valve shims and the cups submerged in good clean oil. So I'm getting ready to put the valve cover back on. And in fact, I started putting the valve cover on only to realize my camera wasn't recording. So at any rate, apologize for skipping over some of that. I have all the cap bolts torqued to spec. It was at 12 foot-pounds is what these are all torqued down to, and everything is in place. So at this point, I do have the new gasket. Zoom out here a bit. I do have the new valve cover gasket in place on the valve cover, and we're getting ready to flip that over and get that installed here. Try to do that without my valve cover coming dislodged. So these are still 10 millimeter. Now, when you go to reinstall the valve cover bolts, you'll notice there is a shorter version like this, and so there's a shorter version and a slightly longer version. So the longer ones will go here in the center. And as with everything, you always want to get those started by hand. You know, just snugging these down by hand gently. I'm going to go check the manual to see if there is a torque spec for these. All right. So the cylinder head cover does have a torque spec, and it's 6 to 9 foot-pounds is the specification here. My smaller torque wrench only inch inch-pounds, so I need to convert, and which makes sense. There are 12 inch-pounds to every foot-pound, just like a measurement on a tape measure. So 9 times 12, I want to come back to 108. That should be 108 right there. Oh. All right. Okay. The last thing is there were a few broken exhaust valve been too much on valves. There were a few broken studs, exhaust manifold studs on this particular head. So I need to pull some off of our donor motor. Okay, so at this point I'm going to show you how to remove a exhaust stud if you don't know already. But here's one that I took off the other motor. And basically what you do is put two nuts back to back and lock them in tight. So you got it's called a jam nut. So you put one nut on, jam it. These happen to be flange nuts, so I put the flanges together so it'd have more bite. But when you put them together and wedge them tight, it essentially makes a head for the bolt. And then you can just screw that in to wherever you want to put this. As you can see, it's turning the whole shaft and just making this whole thing tight. Get that good and tight. Now I can put the wrench on the back nut to hold it. These are just 12 millimeter, and then break it apart. And just remove the heads or the nuts, and boom, you have an exhaust manifold stud installed. Okay, so I hope this was somewhat helpful for you. I do apologize for missing some of the assembly footage. You know, I was into it, didn't realize my camera had died, so putting that rear camshaft in, you know, it's like putting the front one in. You go through a very similar process of getting it aligned. It wasn't worth tearing the motor down again just to get the video footage. So if you found that as a critical piece, I apologize. However, if you just get yourself a good service manual, it has all the steps in there that you need to do. Or if you're not comfortable doing this kind of work, as always, take it to a mechanic who is comfortable in doing that. So there's a few other pieces to this bike that I'm going to be working on. We're going to be cleaning the carbs in the next video, and then also have a small, like the fuel inlet tube on the carb had a crack in it. This happened to be a bronze or copper tube, and so we're going to re-braze that, solder that to fix that leak. And then so I'll make another follow-up video to that piece. So as always, thank you so much for watching. Hope this was helpful. This is Tim Two Wheels, and that's how I did it.